We are Subversive History. We're a multimedia community project seeking to bring attention to the revolutionary struggles of the world's often unsung and frequently misunderstood sectors. These are the stories of the demonized, vilified, whitewashed, or otherwise forgotten campaigns against imperialism, colonialism, capitalist exploitation, and racial apartheid. The orthodoxy of Western hegemony has often labeled these dissidents as subversive. And these are the struggles that we aim to illuminate while also simultaneously struggling. And joining us today is Sina Rahmani, social scientist.
Wait, Johnny. There's a
Whoa.
couple people saying that we're like it's real quiet. Like I don't want you to go into the.
Well, it's you're kind of like dipping in and out. I would say. I think I hear you fine, Pat.
Okay.
Can I hear technically? Can I understand? No. Pretty quiet.
Oh
Does
man.
Sound okay, chat? Maybe we'll just kick Johnny off the chat. He can go home.
That hurts.
The role of Johnny will be played by Sini.
Yeah, I just didn't want Johnny. I didn't want you to launch into that whole introduction for our guest here with us not being able to hear it. So let's just try to get that under wraps right now, just so that we don't have any issues. So what? Oh, Frankenpanny, thank you so much for gifting that tier 1 sub to Ree. And Ree, perhaps the most deserving recipient of gifted subs in this channel. Thank you so much for allowing them to not see ads and supporting us monetarily. We really appreciate that.
All right, let's see how much of this I get wrong, just from Googling Sina Rahmani.
Did you Google me? You don't have to Google me. I can just tell you who I am.
All right, why don't you just tell us who you are?
I am Sina Rahmani. I am a podcaster and I have my own show. This is a legit interviewee. No, I'm not legit. I am a podcaster. I have a show called The East is a Podcast, and I produce a couple of other shows. You should listen to them. One of the shows I produce is It's the Red Nation podcast. Proud of that show. Another show I produce. I showed a couple of other ones you should listen to. MacDeasy Street is the newest one that I helped launch. That's a fantastic one with the 3 MacDeasy brothers. They're professors. You should check this all out. So yeah, that's what I do. My background is 19th century British literature for some reason. I studied that, and I did a PhD in comparative literature. Actually, and it's funny, this chapter is probably the most I'm the most complimentary of my studies to this, because this is something that's always bugged me in my reading, and a lot of the sort of background, sort of philosophical debates that take place in sort of literary studies, that the sort of underpinnings of that. I mean, it is a liberal discipline, and it is filled with like liberal people who are practitioners of it. And many who also call themselves Marxists too, who are also liberals. So yeah, we can. This was an interesting read. I'd read part of the Lasordo book. I think I read the intro in chapter 1 for something. But this chapter was interesting, and it'll be fun to talk about. And yeah, absolutely. we can jump around. I'm riddled with ADHD too, so we have no problems keeping unfocused.
I guess
that's the whole point of Twitch, isn't it?
Yes.
I guess for me, like obviously we have like something that's like somewhat specific here to discuss, being Liberalism by Domenico Lacerdo, but this is in fact the first time like I'm meeting you and being exposed to your way of thinking and your personal philosophies on things. So I guess I would be interested, before we actually jump into the meat of this book and its contexts and things like that, like just kind of like what perspective are you coming at this from? Like what could you just give me like kind of like an introduction to our audience, kind of where you sit politically, what your like general kind of like beliefs are and things like that you would be absorbing this book from?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, yeah, like I'm kind of like I guess in some ways the best way to describe me is a kind of like reformed, a liberal humanist. Like my training, as I said, was in this kind of literary vibe. I mean, a lot of my teachers were liberals, and yeah, like a lot of the people I read, and literary criticism as a whole has a very intensely liberal sort of like underpinning to it, and not just like modern version of it, but historically too, going back. I had kind of undergrad, I did critical theory and cultural studies for some reason, and that was the kind of vibe of the moment. It was like the mid 2000s. I'm 40, so I did my undergrad like in the first half of the 2000s, in those wonderful years of race hating the Middle East and bombing Iraq and
Right.
Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Not that that's changed, not that that's new,
No.
but essentially, I would say that, like I kind of developed into this Marxist mode. A big influence of mine in the early days of my work was probably Edward Said.
Oh, yeah.
I would say a probably big influence, and that's my show, The East is a Podcast. There's a kind of allusion to him in the title, which is he used a quote from Benjamin Disraeli's novel Tancred, where there's a line one of the characters says. He says, "Oh, sorry, I hiccuped." He says, "What did he say?" He says, "Oh, the East is a career," and that's a line from the Benjamin Disraeli, and Said used that as a epigraph for his book. So yeah, and I would say that over the course of my years podcasting, I started doing, I found myself getting radicalized more. I guess my trajectory from literary studies to podcasting is like one of triggered by a failure to get a job or success at not getting a job, depending on how you want to read it. Which is to say that I tried to get a job in the kind of normal way, and then after a while, it didn't. I wasn't inspired, really. I didn't care enough about literary criticism to just eat shit for a decade of my life, which is like one route that you have to do.
Right.
You have to do like the lectureship and the postdoc route, and I just didn't care. So I stopped doing that, and I started, just being extremely online, and which is itself its own mental warpness, but at least it was free. At least it didn't cost me.
Because I was about to say, like, wouldn't you have to, all those things you were talking about, did you have to like pay for that out of your own pocket?
Grad school, well, you pay for undergrad, generally,
Right.
unless you get like some kind of scholarship. But in grad school, you aren't doing it right if you're paying for it. So you should get funding. That's the whole point. Getting into grad school, which is to say, is not the hard part. Getting funded into grad school is the hard part.
Right.
So yeah, I got funded to get into grad school. That was part of the PhD. That's part of the application process, that you're applying to get funded, and it is a job. I mean, it's a very poorly paid job,
Right.
and it has this sort of like holdover of a kind of like apprentice model, where you're sort of apprenticing to be a scholar, for X many years. It's very silly and it's very exploitative. And it's actually like the whole pyramid scheme of the university is based on a class of people like me. Is that you go in with the idea that, oh, one day I'll get paid well, and so it's worth it to make nothing in my 20s,
Right.
and to fall back in my like most productive years.
Like you said, eat shit for like a decade.
Yeah. And that's when I meant eat shit for a decade, was eat shit as a 30-year-old, because that's really the model now, is that you do nothing, you sort of scrape by until somebody, a department, takes pity on you. And that's, those are your 30s. So if people are listening to this considering going to grad school, I would say don't, because you are essentially, or if you do it, go into it with the mindset that you won't get a job, not because you're like not deserving of one or like you're not good enough, but it's more that like the system is rigged towards a certain kind of class reproduction. And even when it's not, you are aiding and abetting this kind of exploitative economy, this like terribly exploited economy. And yeah, like that for me, that has been one of the joys of podcasting and kind of being extremely online, is that like I get all the academia I want without any of the payment. It's like the Goodwill Hunting thing of like, you could get the same education with like $15 in late fines from a library. But now this isn't autodidactism in the same way, because you are interacting a lot of the times with these people that you can learn from, right? Because a lot of people who work online, you can interact with them. You can go and message them and whatever. And unless they're complete dicks, they will probably get back to you. Right. So it is, we are living at this interesting time where the internet has really remapped knowledge making. not just like inside the ivory tower, but also outside. And so, yeah, like there is like the promise of the internet has been kind of fulfilled in a sense that it has democratized media production, and also because of just like straight up piracy of libgen and sci-hub and stuff, is that you don't need to have access to like a big fancy library to like get cool books. You could just get them for free when you just like 6 letters, 6 characters, and you add a .com, and you're there. It's like the best library in the world. So these are things that have come into existence since I started, I think even in grad school. I mean, I started grad school before YouTube was a thing. I'm pretty sure YouTube started in like
even before Wikipedia, huh?
You know, Wikipedia had just started when I was an undergrad. Gotcha. I remember undergrad, like there was no laptops. Like very few people had laptops. I got a laptop in my 4th year, and that laptop cost me $2,000, and it was rare. So, you know, a lot has changed since then, since like, you know, fucking 20 years, which is like insane to think about it. But yeah, that's kind of my trajectory. And I would say now, and you know, when you do, and I'm sure you guys have known this online, when you do this stuff online, you tend to get radicalized. You tend to radicalize yourself, and the people you encounter radicalize you, you know? So I like to joke with people, and it's not a joke, that like, oh, I'm like, I went from being in like the de-radicalization business in like a university to like the radicalization business of like online media, because like ultimately like that's like the, you know, if you're dedicated to the political struggle of all of this, then yeah, like part of this is like radicalizing people, right, and showing and trying to like deconstructing, you know, the very liberal underpinnings, the very hegemonic liberalism that underpins a lot of our institutions that we're seeing now just completely flail in this genocidal war. And like how, you know, it's not the first time we've seen professional liberals just like look the other way at stuff or openly lie about stuff. I mean, this is a cherished tradition of liberals, but it's just the blatant, the fact that it's so in your face, like the reality of it versus like how they spin it for you. Like that is I think is an interesting time. It makes this kind of like a sort of a politically potential filled time, I guess. That, you know, will lead to a lot of people being radicalized. Like a lot of people are literally being radicalized right now.
Oh yeah.
Just by
Ninja Can. Thank you so much for the tier 3 subscription. We appreciate that so much. Wow, 12 months, 1 year with us this whole time. Sorry to cut you off, but it's very important.
No, that's fine. You got to thank
when people do this. Ninja Can, one of our moderators, one of our most appreciated community members, has been with us for 12 months. That's 1 whole year. Thank you so much.
Despite his French Canadian,
despite your French Canadian
deficiencies.
Yeah.
Hey, I live with a bunch of French Canadians. Okay, I will have you know they are very racist. But they make good contractors.
That's so funny.
A French Canadian is my contractor. He fixed my entire house. I love that guy. Thanks, Dom. I know you're not listening. I know you don't use the internet very much.
It'd be kind of wild if he was like a subversive history fan.
Yeah, he's just like, yeah, what the fuck?
My neighbors like don't know where countries are. They're like, like they're not like they're all like reactionary liberals. No, sorry, they're like reactionary like rural conservatives, and they like you like tell them they like talk to me. I think I joked about this once on Twitter. They like look at me and like when they meet me and they like learn my name, they try to like you see like the gif of the woman doing math in her brain, and it's like they're trying to triangulate like my skin color and like the fluency of my English and like why I live among them, and like they just can't figure it out.
I thought that like Iranian diaspora was like real big in Canada. I thought like
not where I live.
I thought Toronto's second name was Toronto. Like
I escaped Toronto and I went to the far north for a reason, including and Iranians are one of those reasons. In fact,
wow.
Hopefully they don't follow me to my town. I'm not going to say the name of my town.
Yeah, don't dox yourself.
Yeah, I'm gonna dox myself. But yeah, so I would say that was that my general trajectory has to do with Yeah, like encountering a more radicalized education online for free that in some ways has really, I think, complemented and also subverted, hence the name of your podcast, of your
There you
stream,
go.
subverted my sort of liberal, deeply liberal education,
So,
professional education.
I have a couple branch offs from what you were saying. And that's Johnny. Do you have anything you want to add to that real
Go
quick?
ahead, bud.
I don't want to hog all the questions right now, but for one, the first part was I know that you said that you take a lot of inspiration from General Edward Said, who I'm also a real big fan of. I just ran over to my bookshelf and had to grab a couple of these just so I could hold them up to the camera real quick because that's what I tend to do.
Those are some great ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I was curious to ask you because you identified as a Marxist, correct?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
yeah, more or less. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. But I was just curious, what is your opinion on like maybe the conundrum that I also experience in a different respect as someone who's a huge fan of Said and his writings and his, in my opinion, very poignant criticisms of Marx and like certain Orientalist natures of Marxist writings. And then it's like, maybe, Edward Said is actually something that helped me like understand that like, maybe Marx was not perfect on everything, and there's other perspectives to this that come from other cultures and things like that. Do you have anything that you can add to that? Because like Edward Said is one of these people that is so respected on the left, but also has written direct, criticisms of Marx and Marxism, which, I think it's healthy to like explore the dialectic of those two, opposing forces in philosophy.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think there's an easy explanation.
Sure.
Is that Edward Said was like a liberal humanist, like period, like
which is what you identified as prior to more of a transition to Marxism, correct?
Yeah, because and partly because of his influence, but also because like that was the milieu I was raised in. That's like the air I breathed for a long time, and I guess in some ways you could say that Edward Said was like a anti-communist. You can say that. That's a fair thing to say. I think he was raised in that anti-communist milieu. I mean, this guy went to Princeton and Harvard. He went to Harvard first, then Princeton, or the other way around? No, Princeton, then Harvard.
Yeah, because
and
then I believe he lost his tenure at Harvard because of his advocacy for Palestine. I think that was the big controversy between him.
No, he wasn't. No, he was never tenured at Harvard. He was a PhD student at Harvard. He studied with this guy named Monroe Engel, who was a Victorianist.
Right.
And then he got his job straight out of straight out of grad school, the way one did at those days, especially if you were like one of the elite who went to these schools and sort of built to these schools. Now, if you read Out of Place, he talks a little bit about the sort of life in universities and Princeton a little bit. I think he called it like a boys' club. Like something like that in that. He's funny, and then he like defended it later. He's like, oh, it's different now. But no, Said was like a product of the American like upper caste like class system. Like that's what he was. Like that's what, but his being Palestinian, like his own Palestinian heritage was in contradiction. Like was like he was a living contradiction to his class because those people are deeply anti-Palestinian and deeply anti-Arab. And it's like part of this like white, like waspy milieu that even in his time, like they had like, I think in the Out of Place book, he talks about like the eating clubs of Princeton and stuff and how like Jews weren't allowed. And like, this guy saw this, he was the 50s. Yeah. Can you imagine like going to Princeton in the 50s? I mean, these were basically KKK members. like these were like rich KKK members that he went to school with and was like educated with. And, sure, like over time, I bet like, he probably felt like a freak among them. And yeah, he did gravitate towards people of his own background, because I'm pretty sure he went to school with Ibrahim Abu Lughod. I think that's where they met. Maybe I'm like mixing a lot of stuff up, but like, essentially Edward Said's, like trajectory from kind of like this, respectable English literary scholar, which he always was his whole life, to, like spokesman of this like radical anti-colonial struggle. Like this is something that he himself was a contradiction of his own sort of like identity. That, yeah, of course, there's nothing that inherently says that like like a professor who's like born of these realms can't be politically radical, but it's deeply unlikely, right? That like this is not the purpose of these schools. The purpose of these schools is to reproduce a class of people, and then to like babysit the actual people who are reproduced by this class of people for like 4 years, and like send them to finishing school and whatever. Like that's what a lot of school is, and that's what it was for his day. That's what it is today for a lot of these like Harvard and Princeton and stuff. I mean, this is where you go and make your contacts, and like this is where how you get a job, and like your Harvard email address opens the door for you like decades later. And yeah, it's like that. And so I think it's interesting and Said was an interesting character insofar as his background. He was informed by let's say so for instance, let's put it this way, the Orientalism has this kind of has these influences of, on the one hand, it has an influence of like Michel Foucault, who was like kind of politically an anarchist, which is to say he was a liberal. And also on the other hand, Antonio Gramsci, whose birthday it was, I think yesterday, right? So Antonio Gramsci's, and like he kind of combined this kind of Gramscian, Foucauldian, analytical frame to do his reading, and then he sort of like applied that kind of thinking to scholarship around the Middle East, around like the so-called Middle East, and so in that way, like that was the sort of revolutionary aspect of his studies, that he took these kind of Western frameworks, analytical frameworks, and he applied them to Western scholarship of the so-called East, right, of the so-called Islamic and Oriental world. And that was a kind of, and that was his kind of radical gesture of Orientalism. And then he followed it up with the two sequels, sequels. God, you've been on long too much. When you followed it up with like, I think the next one was Question of Palestine. And then the following one was
Orientalism.
covering, Orientalism, Question of Palestine, and then covering Islam.
Doesn't he have a book specifically called Imperialism? There's one of his books that has the word imperialism in the title too, doesn't it?
Isn't that Imperialism and its Discontents or something? No, that's Peace Process and its Discontents. I don't remember actually.
Yeah, sorry.
And the Said literary universe.
He and then so these three books they're kind of you should read them together, and they're kind of, Orientalism is obviously much like different book than the other two.
Correct.
The other two are less scholarly studies and more kind of essayistic. I've always felt that Orientalism is his last book in the way we call sort of academic books, right? Is that it's the kind of, in terms of as a study as a whole, that he kind of envisioned from beginning to end, whereas everything after Orientalism, if you look, is a kind of collection of essays, including Culture and Imperialism, which was a kind of something he published, which were a bunch of his different writings that came about as a result of like the fame that Orientalism brought him, because it really was a kind of like big book, and it did sort of kick off his, for lack of better word, academic celebrity. And it has been influential. It's one of the more influential books of the 20th century,
of course.
So in that way, that it's an interesting contradiction. Like here's this guy, he takes these Marxists and ostensibly leftist critical figures in Foucault and Gramsci, and then he applies it to this mostly pretty conservative field of scholars, who range from eras, from like 18th century, so-called philologists, to, like Bernard Lewis, who's like a straight up, like, colonial bureaucrat, like basically connected to the, imperial deep state of the US. And that's how he like made his name, was like getting access into like the Ottoman archives, because of his like being connected to like this world. Like he was, and he was at Princeton for like literally decades.
Yeah.
That guy was alive for so long. I mean, he was like almost as old as Kissinger when he fucking kicked the bucket.
Wow.
Was he
And,
as
like,
old as what's his name? Edward L. Bernays?
maybe. I don't
Edward
know,
L. Bernays
actually.
was what, like 108 or something when he finally died. He literally lived from like the beginning of like the 1900s until like the 90s.
Yeah, he lived a long time.
It's
He
insane.
lived 104. He lived 104. He was in his 90s. What's his name? I forget his name already. Bernard Lewis. He lived till his 90s. 1916 to oh my God, what are you talking about? He lived 102. My God.
Wow.
So almost as old. So yeah, this was Said was an interesting character. I mean, yeah, sometimes I go back, I sort of think about like my original project to do a PhD was to kind of write an intellectual biography of Edward Said. And I wanted to do that. And then one day I just was like, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I just like did something else. And actually it relates to the content of this book because I studied, my dissertation ended up being on orphanhood and the British novel, and how basically the shorthand version of the argument is that orphans are so prevalent in fiction, and a specific kind of fiction, namely like the British novel, partly because of like the 18th and 19th centuries, is that partly because they embody a kind of individualism,
Right.
that they're model individuals, and they teach us a lot about individualism, insofar as they make these, they have these like affiliations, right? So if you know Edward Said, I kind of borrowed this term from him, and I kind of used it, this sort of Saidian framework, to think about 19th century literature. And so in some way, I should have read this essay. It was available, 2011, right? I should have totally read this essay and cited it in my dissertation. But it wasn't, I was too much like up my own ass of literary studies to think about these things, and like obsessed with formalism. Really, formalism was a disease of my life. So it was like the novel, and its various kind of like growth and whatever. And, I mean, that's not itself a liberal practice, but certainly my approach, you can totally call liberal. Like if you read my dissertation, it's a totally liberal dissertation. Don't read my fucking dissertation, you weirdos.
Well, now they're gonna.
So
they're gonna smear you on Twitter for it.
Yeah. Don't read my dissertation. Get a life. Every month I get an email from like the UC system. They're like, 11 people have downloaded your dissertation. It's like, what the hell is wrong with you?
Number's about to be a lot bigger, Sina.
Go outside.
So I guess like now we've kind of like gone into like kind of like your like general background and like a lot of information that to make everyone a little bit more intimately aware of kind of the perspective that you're coming from. And I guess then just to have this conversation about, this book and this topic and this author, I kind of would want to pose to you the same question that is posed at the very beginning of this book. And that is the question, what is liberalism? And now when I ask that, I kind of want to ask that like from your perspective, I guess as it stands now. And I guess you can maybe talk about maybe your evolution as someone who kind of was more of like the progressive liberal humanist that transitioned into a Marxist, if I understand your trajectory correctly. Like maybe you can talk about like that situation and how that maybe applies to the book a little bit.
Well, I guess in some ways, like liberalism is a kind of is a generalized, isn't a how do you do this? I guess for me, liberalism entails is a shorthanded attempt to resolve a contradiction, insofar as the modern state is built around this fetishization of taking care of a person, even if it's like in the form of, like, or at least in its ability to sort of prove to its so-called citizen subjects that, it has this ability to sort of care for them, and it is this kind of protective state. But like at the end of the day, like a state like doesn't exist, right? Like it's not like a place you go, right? That it's like it's a set of institutions and like a body of laws that are undergirded by a system of violence,
Yeah.
right? Like that's ultimately what like any state is,
Correct.
right?
Right.
Like it doesn't matter what kind of state. And in some ways, like liberalism has infected our thinking around these states, right? That like how we imagine and like our relationship to them. But what liberalism also like doesn't do, and or at least what it tries to sort of like escape from or square the circle maybe, is that like the individual and their so-called rights, their so-called human rights that are afforded to them by these modern states, uh, the principal right that matters the most, like far and away more than anything else, is the right to circulate as a commodity, right?
Right.
And like this is not something that like liberals like to talk about, that like, you know, your individualism is intimately tied to this material system. And for us it's so-called late capitalism, which is like an old term that people don't use,
Right.
but I'm just going to use it. It's from, what's the guy's name? His name is escaping me. Late capitalism. Ernst Mandel. He was a Belgian guy. And so like late capitalism is this kind of thing, is this kind of system that we're born into. You know, some people, I don't like this term, sort of used postmodern as like a slur, but really
Right.
it's like late capitalism. And in some ways that like the overlay of liberalism and its sort of like ethical pretenses to care for the individual have really deeply, profoundly like leaked into its own self-image, and also how we understand that state, either in a good way or in a bad way, right? So that like the right wing of like the US or whatever, or here too in Canada,
Same thing.
that yeah, same thing. We're like a fucking satellite offshoot. Is that like that? And that's something to talk about. Is that like that's part of the nature of capitalism, that it doesn't really care about international boundaries. In some ways, it doesn't. Is that like a transnational, like commodification is bigger than the national laws that supposedly govern it, right? And
It cares when it's convenient to its ends.
yeah, when it benefits itself, right? So that like, or in some ways it's like the contradictions, that's when like the contradictions come up, is through these sort of laws and this sort of like, you know, or warring elites between different countries. That could be like a different way, but either way I would say that liberalism is this attempt to like overlay the like material brutality and like inequality of late capitalism, and its hyperfixation on the sort of infinite circulation of goods and people, and those two in a lot of ways are like the same thing. And to overlay that with this kind of like ethical performance of care. I mean, that's not like a technical, and I would even say correct way of defining liberalism in like a political science way, but I would say that, and it's deeply tied to the individual, to like the fetishization of the individual, a kind of like, and also a kind of manufactured individual that's kind of like idealized,
Right.
and totally refracted from like the sort of material and social sort of contradictions that go into that, right? And so like the classic example is like the US Constitution or whatever, the Declaration of Independence, right? It's like these people, these like slave owners talking about like all men being equal, right? Is that the Constitution? I don't remember. Yes, that's like
The Bill of Rights, I believe.
yeah, or whatever. Yeah, like the sort of that the machinery of like bourgeois liberal
Whatever
democracy,
bullshit says that.
it's all bullshit. But like ultimately like these are people who were like literally owning other human beings,
Right.
and like killing them whenever they wanted to for fun, saying, oh yes, everyone is equal. Well, it's like the root of that, and I think this is like goes to the core of the argument of this book, is like, well, you could just put a bunch of like stars on that or asterisks and be like, except for them, except for them.
I would add one more thing to that, and that is specifically in this chapter, you know, Lacerdo mentions that like even those people that attempted to like, you know, purchase the freedom of their slave, or attempted to assist this underprivileged or this oppressed, you know, segment of the population, they would be punished. So even if you have solidarity, and even if that, like, you go out of your way, right, with the privilege of whatever position of class that you have to help those, you are punished. And I think that we even see that, happening today, right? We see that, like, people with any kind of position of privilege within academia, within just Hollywood or media in general, right? Wasn't Mark Lamont Hill, like, he lost his job for being outspokenly pro-Palestine?
Hassan lost his job.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's many, what is it even like, Norm Finkelstein and Cornell
Norm
West
Finkelstein.
and
Oh my
many of
God.
these
Yeah.
people that are in the higher echelons of academia in this country are jeopardized by, giving a sincere and full-throated support to something like Palestinians' right to resist.
Right. And we saw the same thing, I think maybe to a lesser degree, but the same thing even during, the Black Lives Matter protests, right, in 2020, where people were, again, losing their jobs, people were losing contracts, people were, like, forced out of positions, people were slandered, and like, the public, maybe not jailed all of the time, but to some degree, you saw a lot of people, like, experience a lot of hostilities for using whatever position within this class strata, right, to assist those people that, like, are what's the term, like the subaltern, right, within American, like, class stratification.
So, and it's like the contradictions of like liberal humanism or whatever, like the contradictions of like a liberal culture, we could say, is that, oh, you have free speech, and those places that aren't liberal like us, they lack free speech and they don't have those things. But it's like, oh wait, but we don't either, right? Like, people lose their jobs all the time for saying stuff. It's just like, this is something that, like, they can look the other way. And so right now is actually a useful time to be talking about liberalism, because you see it's like full-blown fraudulence, like, splayed out for you, just like right there, like a fucking corpse of like a cow on a butcher block. You can just see it and like dissect it.
The sacrificial altar block of liberalism.
It's right there.
I've actually made an comparison, right? And this is something that I was making of certain avowed liberal streamers who, when it came to like the Hong Kong protests, or when it came to Ukraine or something like that, they took a very, a typical position that you would, it's a typical kind of liberal position. However, now that I've said that some of these, I refer to these liberal streamers or liberals now, the mental gymnastics that they have to go through to figure this out. I refer to it as their tanky arc, because now we're actually seeing these like liberal individuals, like, you can shove a human rights report in their face and they're like, no, wait, hold on. Who funded this? Like, it's like normally the people that are doing the most to uphold the establishment and like be like, look at all the, like, now they are the ones that are like wriggling through, like, well, this could all be full of lies. You never know who published this or who did this, and it's like
no, we do though.
So it's like an interesting kind of like role reversal now, where they're being faced with kind of like, a broader international liberal institution set of criticisms that come from things like Human Rights Watch, that they're having to kind of wiggle their way through and justify it.
Destiny, I believe, yesterday or today was on with or meeting in person Ben Shapiro and his allegedly
that's the omni-liberal weirdo, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh God.
He's apparently now coming out as a Republican. He's betraying his...
like this is the liberal problem, is like when confronted with like the hypocrisy of their supposed position, because liberalism also claims to be this universal ethos, right, and it claims to hold a kind of moral superiority over other political systems, right? Like, it's this striving towards this perfect acceptance. This is why they like fetishize so-called like equality. This is why they're obsessed with like, oh, let's just fix representation problems. Let's just represent harder. Let's represent more equally. Like, these are things that liberals like fundamentally believe in, because this is like part of the superficiality of their worldview. Now, modern liberals, the way we call them libs, like the way like communists call libs, is not like, you can't just say that's not like coterminous with liberalism. like because in some ways, like liberals today define their identity most strongly, at least consciously, against conservatives.
Right. But
And
both
their own
liberals
political
and
milieu.
conservatives are proponents of liberalism, right?
Yeah, exactly. But just two
I've
different
gotten into
strains
this
of it,
argument
yeah.
with someone before where like, they were like, okay, yeah, well, that's like a liberal way of thinking. And I'm like, well, like, conservatives and liberals are both liberalism is the overarching understanding of like the way that the overall philosophy of society, regardless of if you believe in like these Enlightenment style values that come like kind of really emanate from the French Revolution, and that you believe in these things like freedom of speech, freedom of property, and representative republicanism and things like that. Like that is very much a liberal way of thinking, and like not even to say like that either of those things are like bad or like whatever, but it's like you have to understand that the most conservative person in the United States is very much liberal.
Yeah, and a very enthusiastic proponent of liberal individualism.
Exactly.
Right. And like partly what happens is that like political disputes get completely like sucked into the realm. It's like a Kirby or something. You're just completely sucked in to the sort of like framework or paradigm of culture war, right? So you fight over like people with a dress in a bathroom because like that's the thing that makes you mad. But like ultimately like you agree on like the major points and like the basic structure of the society, of the economy, of like that certain people own a great percentage of the economy and others don't, right? That like the material laws of gravity are shared by liberals and conservatives and not alike, more so than they like to imagine. That like, and like, yeah, okay, they'll fight over like welfare and refugee reform and migrant crisis and this and like, but ultimately like that's culture war shit. That's
but then
just
when
like
something like Gaza
shit
happens, they're both like, oh yeah, well, I mean, obviously we need to be funding this.
But even to
there's no disagreement on this situation whatsoever.
Even to that end though, right? Like the over trans rights and everything, right? Like, like you said before, they'll be like, oh, we need more like representation. We need more like, trans congressmen or something. But the second that they actually do get one, and that there is any sort of like fight for federal protection of trans people, right? That they are barred, right, from being able to speak, right? And they largely, as a party, have done nothing in 4 years to federally protect trans people. There's Aaron in the Morning that I follow that like every fucking day there's some new monstrous bill that's being passed in like Ohio or some other state that like, is just dehumanizing.
And this is actually a facet of liberal democracy, because ultimately you have this class of people called politicians who thrive in these atmosphere, in this kind of like swamp, this kind of cultural swamp, and they need to feed the sort of culture war machine. Right. And so like Trump rode owning the libs all the way to the fucking White House.
Right.
Right. He just owned the libs upwards. And like that was his entire brand. And it still works. It still works. Like it's going to work all the way again to the White House, barring some deep state fuckery. Like he will totally win. And that's partly because of the nature of liberal democracy, because people are put in charge for X amount of time, and they make things worse for everyone, because that's also the nature of like capitalist economies, is that like things get worse and worse and worse. Exploitation goes up and up and up, and like corporate, like extraction of wealth goes up and up and up from like basic workers, right? Like, and people naturally blame the people they can, like on like, oh, okay, now we do musical chairs again, and somebody else comes in, right? And so like Trudeau was beloved at the beginning of his like prime ministership here, and now he's hated, right? And now he'll go and make a lot of money as like a public speaker and a lawyer and a whatever, and like he'll profit off of that, and like this is the game. And then some conservative freak will come into power next.
Yeah, don't you guys have like Polyview or whatever the hell his name is?
Yeah, whatever his name is, Pierre Poilievre. I honestly do not understand the politics of Canada, and I don't care to. Like, I don't vote. I don't give a shit. Like I probably should, but I don't give a shit. I don't like. They're all ghouls. Like they're all Zionist ghouls. First of all, like NDP, they put a brown guy. They put a brown guy in top, but he's just another fucking Zionist. Who cares? If
Look at fucking England now.
Yeah, exactly. Rishi fucking Sunak.
Which is the other side of this chapter. Was like it not only posits like is America liberal, but is England liberal?
Yeah, I mean, it's a liberalism is bigger. And also there's another thing in all of this is that we're now in the era of neoliberalism. Right. Is that the neoliberal, like the rise of neoliberalism, partly it's like it's first and foremost is it's an economic history first. You have to frame it through. Exactly. Yeah. 100% of parliament gave a standing ovation to a monstrous fucking Nazi.
Which, by the way, it wasn't even like it was a mystery. It literally all you would have had to have done is just Google this man's name, right? And you would have seen his record come up of volunteering for the SS.
Listen, this is my take on it. It's correct that they plotted for a Nazi. Why? Because Canada itself is part of the same like violent, like race hate machine as Nazism, and is in fact like has claimed probably more bodies and is responsible for more deaths when you include its entire colonial history. And so part of the problem here is that we've come to, and I think communists are guilty of this too, we've come to accept this very liberal thing of holding up Nazis as the worst things ever. Right. And that gives their own guys an out. That gives their own heroes an out. Exactly. Yeah. They have a whole bunch of statues of a bunch of like insane racists that like the principles of liberalism and the principles of Nazism aren't that far off. Right.
They were inspired by policies of the U.S. They were inspired by like the policies, not just of like the genocide of indigenous people, the ongoing genocide, mind you, but like, also its race laws, regarding its enslaved population. Right. Then like, to go back on it, and especially, to Lacerdo's legacy, right. He was lambasted for bringing up the idea that like, what is it that like the Shoah was that the genocide of I'm sorry, what are the two populations in Africa, Pat, that the Germans,
the Nama and the Herero,
right, that like they massacred them, or like what the Japanese did in China, or like what like the Turks and Kurds did to the Christian Armenians, right, in Armenia, right, like
genocide is a global history,
right,
and sure, like Europeans perfected it into an art, and it's basically it's essentially the basis of their global power, which is like that's what this is the era that we're in now, is the era of Europe, right? Like Europe just respun as America, or respawned.
Columbian era.
Yeah, like this is the era we're in. It's 500 years long of like white European supremacy. And who's good on this is actually a good critique of all this is Gerald Horne, right? Like Gerald Horne will clean your clock any day of the week, and he'll ethnically cleanse your brain of all this hogwash, of all this liberal hogwash. Because in the end, like it's like I had this joke the other day in our Tanky Therapy that it's like Homer in the lesbian bar moment. And it's you stare into the abyss of white supremacist
Can we get some
history.
Simpsons memes in chat? We have the emote now. We have the emote now. And it wasn't even me that did it. Now our guest did it. So we're going to need to see some Simpsons Castros in chat, please. Thank you.
You stare into that history, and it's one of like never-ending genocide. It's billions of human beings either enslaved, erased.
I would also recommend Mike Davis's book,
Victorian Holocaust,
The Making of the Third World, El Nino Famines and the Making of the Third World. That was the book that really opened my. I kind of call that book the Black Book of Capitalism. Except it's true, except it's actually accurate. But like the same way you could kind of like throw like the people like to parade around the Black Book of Communism, despite it being a work of charlatanism.
A book filled with Nazis.
But whereas late Victorian Holocaust, like most people don't know that in the 1800s and early 1900s, more starved to death in India than most things that are generally put to completely wipe the idea of communism out of any kind of credibility. People don't even know about the amount of people, and then not even to not to mention, the massive famine they had in 1945. I'm talking under Churchill. I'm talking about the ones that are as pretty much as a direct result of liberal capitalist economic, top-down economic, implementation on, subsistence farmers that were not monocropping into an extremely perverse style of cash cropping that their communities were never set to for generations, and then they died en masse once the equilibrium was ruptured. Most people wouldn't even be able to tell you about that. A lot of people would be able to tell you about the Holodomor. There's a lot of problems with the Holodomor. You should know about the Holodomor. But
also, about Kazakhstan? They always forget about the fucking Kazakh.
Know about the situations that happened in India several times. You should know what happened in China. You should know what happened in Brazil. And that's the thing. Those are mere footnotes. They don't even cross the mind of most Western people whatsoever, or most people in general.
So the funny thing that you brought up with bringing up the Holodomor, right, is that we don't find any real evidence of purposeful we need to starve these people, right? Sure. We don't find that, right? We don't find that with the Holodomor. We don't find that with Kazakhstan, but we do find that with India. We do find that, right, with
deliberate genocidal rhetoric. It's kind of
right.
It's kind of similar to what we see today in Gaza, you know what I mean? With the amount of rhetoric that we can find from the leading politicians.
Right.
Yeah. No, that's I would agree with that. I think that again, one of the sort of instructive elements of this moment is to see people's so-called sort of global principles just melt away the moment they're confronted with the limit, the specter, or a reflection of their own history, right? And so what's happening in Gaza right now, I mean, although I waffle on this a little bit, is part of a much longer history, and it's an iteration of something that's happened many times before, thousands, if not tens of thousands of times before. Horrible to think this way, but in what happens in Gaza, you can imagine, you can sort of see a reflection of Cromwell burning Ireland. I think that you can he killed 1/3 of the Irish population. I mean, to think of that, the scale of that killing,
right.
And he's held up as a hero, right? He's held up as a liberal hero, for a reason. Right, that this is someone, this machine of liberalism requires a mountain of corpses for it to sort of sustain itself. So the French Revolution, right, at the same time the French Revolution is unfolding, they're murdering another revolution is happening in Haiti, and they're waging a violent counter-revolution.
Well,
right?
And that's one of the principal things that Lacerdo brings up, not in this chapter, but actually I believe it's the chapter following the one that we most were recently reading. But, we're talking about someone like Thomas Jefferson, who has said a lot of very, very fancy things about the virtue of liberalism and the freedom of men and things like that. But then at the moment he finishes writing that paper, he moves his pen over to another paper being we need to stop this slave revolt in Haiti, because that might not be set a good precedent for our own slaves.
This begins America's first embargo and sanctioning of another nation.
Right. Well, and something that I wanted to bring up to you is one of the paradoxes that is brought up in the earlier parts of this book, and I wanted to get your opinion on that. And it's actually a paradox that is actually first formulated by Adam Smith, the renowned economist Adam Smith, where he states he discusses this conundrum of liberalism, and he frames it as a discussion of the abolition of slavery. And he says that a despotic government would have an easier time abolishing slavery than a liberal one, meaning that so now we're in a paradox. Which is the more liberal approach?
Yeah,
is should an authoritarian
tyrant?
A tyrant, which they called Abraham Lincoln.
Despot.
Yeah, exactly. A despot, a tyrannical despot come through and force people to get rid of their slaves, or would a liberal government just kind of have to leave it up to the voting? See, and this is where this really is kind of like a conundrum that, in my opinion, lays bare the issues with liberalism, the paradox of liberalism, the contradictions of liberalism, where it's like, which is more liberal? Is it more liberal to despotically, tyrannically, and authoritatively go in and crush the institution of slavery? Or is it more liberal to allow the states to decide, the constituent parts to have this, republicanism and deciding and representation and things like that, which may allow slavery to proliferate? So it's like, and I know where I stand on this. I think, as somebody who's a communist who, what I mean? Like, I think we're all kind of okay with a certain degree of authoritarianism to stomp out things that we consider putridly authoritarian in society. Whereas something like slavery, there should be no question that we should have an authoritative fucking demolition of that entire institution. I have no problem with that. However, for a liberal, you have to decide, much like John Calhoun did. John Calhoun would say that it's actually the most illiberal thing for you to trample over my right to own another human being. Yeah. Now, in my opinion, owning a human being is the most fundamentally illiberal thing that you can do. However, at the time of abolition, this was not the case among many proponents of liberalism. So I guess I really enjoy discussing and thinking about that contradiction. I was curious if you had anything to contribute on that.
Will the fascists have their newspapers?
Yeah, I mean, this is the like, you're going to like the crux of the matter, like the economic, when the material basis of your life is threatened by theoretical ideas, guess which one is going to win out?
The material.
Guess which one? 100%. Like, you're going to starve for your
gaslight
ideals,
yourself through any fucking ideological shit that you may
so
believe.
This is why the primacy of like the Marxist critique, right, of materialism coming first.
Yeah, that, all idealism, and we've actually had this discussion too, where people have said like, oh, Marxists don't believe in ideology. They don't believe in the effect of ideology. And it's like, no, we do. However, all idealism is subordinated by materialism. That's
you mean that history isn't governed by stories?
That guy, yeah.
By feelings, by vibes.
Exactly. Yeah, vibes-based history.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, this is the thing, like it's partly like you feel for a liberal, right? Because they look at the chaos on this planet, they look at like the genocide in Iraq, right, which is what it was. 1 million people were killed by the U.S., right? Like, that was a genocide.
He's just grabbing a book.
It was just that was just open genocide. They committed it. They're still there. They're still killing people.
And we're going back, round 2.
Yeah, and like this is like and it was actually it was an intensification. Like 2003 was an intensification of a long-term war that began in the 90s, that began with like the response to Saddam invading Kuwait, that like turned into economic war, that was like managed through like political and sort of like hot war, right, through these so-called no-fly zones, right? But like liberalism, to sustain its own image of itself as this force of good, right, needs to use these euphemisms like no-fly zone, right, in order to
Department of Defense.
The Department of Defense, right? Like this era of neoliberalism, and this is one of those facets of it, right? Like I was in Peru for like 3 weeks.
Nice.
And just over Christmas break, and I remember seeing a sign that says it was like the Ministry of Desarrollo, which is like development and social and inclusión social or something like that. And it was like, and I was just thinking about that, and I was like, governments like 100 years ago would laugh at this kind of language, as if they would say like development and social inclusion, right? Like this is like a vestige of a modern, or sort of like a hyper modern way of thinking, of like that governments imagine themselves as this kind of object of care. Now, do people working in those governments, do the policies of those governments work towards those policies? Sure, you can. I mean, maybe, sure. Like, you can say that in some instances. Can you always say that they're not? No, right? But at the same time, though, is that ultimately this care is in the larger confines. It's restricted to the larger confines of creating better consumers, creating better workers, creating better commodities who circulate in more healthy ways, right? Because inclusion into the social, the basis of that is not some kind of like healthy political body where everybody gets a say or and has sovereignty over their being and is connected to their community in healthy ways and blah blah. No, it's about being a functioning, like well-fed, like liberal individual citizen subject of whatever state, right? So like,
I think you pulled that in illustrating kind of what your earlier point was, that there's this kind of like contradiction between the ideology of liberalism and like the material concerns of nations that consider themselves liberal. And you went by Saddam Hussein, and we mentioned that, and I think that that's a very salient example of precisely that, because in the 80s we had no concern over the despotic nature of Saddam
Dude, like
Hussein.
a week beforehand, fucking Rummy was shaking hands with him, like
we had no fucking qualms about that, despite our professed liberalism. It was only when Saddam Hussein started making some economic changes within his own country that he became a real fucking problem that we needed to actually intervene on. It was never a matter of being a tyrant. You know what I mean? That didn't matter. We have been shaking hands with tyrants, and we still do to this very day, that believe in no form of liberalism or democracy or free speech or any of it, even fucking genocide. You know what I mean? Like, we have no qualms about doing business with them. It's really when does it hit the material side of things? When does it hit the geopolitical interest? When does it hit the material, the economic interest? That's when that's when the hammer comes down.
Yeah, in the case of Saddam, right, that it was fine that he, like, when he did the thing
used
to
chemical
Kuwait
weapons against Iran.
Yeah, like when he did the thing to Kuwait that he did against Iran, like it was
Right.
good when he did it to Iran, but it was bad when he did it to Kuwait. Gee, I wonder why, right? Like this is because like the hard power of U.S. imperialism needed him as an ally against Iran, but then it angered them when he used that same logic of, I'm going to invade my neighbors because I want their resources, because I'm a fucking war pig, piece of shit, like union busting, like conservative, anti-communist freak that he was.
He also murdered like a ton of communists. I think like Iraq had like one of the biggest communist parties outside of China and Russia.
He got the list from the United States. He got the list of communist names.
He was like a CIA, subcontractor. Like this is the oldest story in the book. Like the U.S. helped create Saddam, and they emboldened him to the point where like he was their biggest ally, and not just the U.S., the entire Gulf, the Gulf countries. I mean, the PLO took the side of Saddam in that, guys. Think about that for a second.
Wow.
Right? Like, think about the fact that the PLO under Arafat, they took Saddam's side and all of that. The only country, the Arab country that didn't was Syria. And so, like, think about that and, like, what Iran later does for Syria in the 2010s.
Right.
So, like, these are all, like when we talk about, like, realpolitik and, like, warring states and stuff, like, you have to, like, get into the nitty-gritty. But, the liberal brain, like, can't hold this shit in their fucking, like...
No, but they can, though. I argue that they can. If they can follow fucking, like, Game of Thrones, if they can follow fucking...
No, that's the problem. Game of Thrones teaches them about the world. That's I mean, and this is not just like a liberal problem. This is like a modern problem. Like this part of the function of the culture industry is to fill the gap that like our depoliticized hypo neoliberal society leaves us with, right? That like our political desires that go unfulfilled, that like TV and movies and video games fill those for us, that like fiction fills for us. Right. And so like part of the problem is the fact that all these fucking freaks consume shit like, like a George R.R. Martin all day long and it becomes, or Star Wars for fuck's sakes. And even ostensibly Star Wars, which is about this like anti-colonial force, right? It's about like narrating, like the guy, like George Lucas himself was like, oh, it's Vietnam, like America is the empire and like the rebels are Vietnam. But partly it's to help alleviate the guilt and like the terror of knowing that, oh, we killed 5 million people in this war that we ended up losing, right? That like we're a big, powerful country. Like the culture industry is like, there's this almost like Freudian function to it that like it absolves and it like sucks up a lot of energy that exists in us as a result of like how it politically sort of evacuated our culture is and our beings are, because that's what neoliberalism wants for us. Right? It wants us to have a lot of fucking opinions, but none on like the substantial shit on our lives, right? like this is not like it wants us to fight over, you know, like over culture war shit and like what Disney, like boycott Disney and stuff, but like ultimately like it will still eat like out of the pocket of like 4 corporations that like own the entire grocery store, right? Like
Right.
these are
Well, because their
these
only
are, like,
alternative is like, you know, basically starting a garden, like I guess in
Yeah.
their living room, if like you don't actually have any real property that isn't just going to be torn apart by the super that week.
Yeah, exactly. That like because every inch of land is colonized by private capital, that like you can't create any kind of food system for yourself. You're reliant upon this like monstrous system that like this monstrous food system that literally kills you, that's designed to kill you, that like hates poor people and wants them dead at 65 when they can't work anymore, and it's designed to that end.
Right.
I mean, like this is
70
like,
now.
like you can, you know, you can like you couldn't imagine a more evil like interlocking system of cruelty as like neoliberalism. Like really, it's something like we laugh at like medieval peasants, but man, the sophistication of our exploitation is like way higher.
You can
You
laugh
bring
at a
up a
medieval
couple
peasant
things.
all you want, but they had more days off. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
you
go on,
bring up
Pat.
a couple things. You bring up a couple things there that I think tie together really well, especially with this medieval peasantry. And then you brought up the medieval peasantry, and you also brought up the forced nature of wage laboring, you know, that most of us don't have a choice. Like Johnny was saying, you can't even go out and grow food. Maybe you can grow it in your living room, because like I know, for example, where I live and where Johnny lives, there's no place that we could even legally grow food. You know what I mean?
No.
Like, so, and that takes me back to like, you know, back to this more earlier time thing. It brings you back to the enclosure of the commons, where it's like, you know, in this birth of liberalism post the Glorious Revolution, there was the peasantry was abundant in a place like England, where the peasantry, you know, obviously lived an extremely, you know, sparse lifestyle. However, there was these areas called the commons, which is something unthinkable now, just land that people don't own. Like a land with no ownership whatsoever, with no authority whatsoever. Where if you wanted to graze some cattle over there, or if you wanted to plant some food over there or something like that, you could just do that. And maybe, you know, your feudal serf arrangement doesn't, you know, give you that much, you know, in the way of additional income or survival. That's okay, because you can always rely on the commons. You can always rely on the commons for some subsistence farming. And honestly, if you just want to say fuck this whole arrangement, you can go live in the commons and grow food and just live out there. Until there was the enclosure of the commons, in which
Right.
it was essentially the privatizing of this common land, which forced many of the peasantry directly into the urban centers to work wage labor, which they never would have done otherwise. You would have gone to somebody that was a subsistence farm and been like, hey, do you want to go work in this factory for 18 hours a day
and like die, you know, at 47?
Yeah, exactly.
No, not really, boss.
Oh, actually, I graze some cows over here and I sleep in that hut. Like, you know, this is kind of chill for me. Now that is no longer even an option. You have to, like, you know, genuflect at the altar of wage labor. And we can see this replicated in many other societies. We can see this when I talked about these famines that occurred in India. This is precisely what was happening. There was common land that was subsistence farmed by the peasantry, and the British came in and said, no more of that. This is private land. We're growing cotton here. So then now it's like, well, I grew land, I grew food there. Now I can't grow food.
Now you grow commodities.
Right.
I have no choice but to go to a cotton plantation. You also saw all this happening in Guatemala when the liberal revolution, and this is funny, it takes us back to what we're talking about. This is what's known as the liberal revolution in Guatemala, where coffee plantations, sprawling coffee plantations grew all over Guatemala. And there was the Mayan population who was very, very well equipped to their subsistence farming lives, where they had a lot of leisure time. You know, maybe they didn't have a lot of industrialization, material abundance, commodity fetishism, all these types of things. However, they had a lifestyle that fed their families and gave them a certain amount of leisure as well. So when you walked into those communities and said, why don't you come work for pennies on my coffee plantation? They were like, no, I'm good. I don't think I'm going to do that. So then there had to be a deliberate policy of eviction from their lands, so those lands could be transformed into coffee plantations, and then you're essentially creating a massive reserve army of labor because you displaced all these people and took away their subsistence farming method. They have to engage in the most rugged form of wage labor from that point forward.
Yeah, I mean, this is a global story, right? Like, this is part of the story of settler colonialism here in our part of the planet, but also a larger sort of history of how capitalism conquered the planet, and it did so thoroughly. And like, this is something that this is like the material violence of capital,
right,
to like the quality of human life, right? That like, like right wingers especially, and liberals too, they love to cite that, like, oh, humans live longer, like, oh, this and that, like, oh, the green revolution. But like, I'm gonna be like the anti-China guy and be like, yeah, but at what fucking cost? Right? Yeah. Like, this was like, and part of the cost, was like dedicating our lives to commodity production, right? Dedicating our lives to this, like, as you said, like this altar of like the factory, right? And like, like partly what I studied in part of what I studied in grad school was 19th century England, and like these we're talking horror shows. Like, we're talking like a horror show. Like, people would get maimed on the job and they would just laugh, and the person would be hauled out and they'd lose a limb and whatever, and like they had no rights, they get fired.
How old would this person be typically?
Oh, like in their 20s, 30s, maybe. Like,
not 12.
No, like, oh yeah, child labor was a thing, but I'm talking like just like an average worker, right? That like there was like you were on like this was a brutal form of living. You were breathing in all kinds of filth. Like, this was lethal to human life, and it was all for the benefit of like a tiny class of people. Now, has this system changed? Like, in some places, like it's more like it's more visible in some forms, in some aspects of the commodity than in others. Like, has a certain sector of the global working population like become so-called information workers who don't breathe in these things, who just like stare at screens, which is its own violence, but a different kind of violence. It's a mental violence, right? And it's also like a kind of
heart attacks violence too. Cardiovascular issues. Don't forget how
when you incorporate that into like the violence of the food system, like that's a problem.
Yeah.
Right? That like when you turn like human beings that were intended, like we were granted with these bodies by evolution that were designed to like be put into motion, that like our digestive system was designed to like not be fed this much, right? That like not to work this often. And like when you pour them full of like excess commodities that you need to just get rid of, because that's how capitalism is designed, like you need to fill them up with caffeine, and then that caffeine drink is full of sugar.
Let's not bring caffeine into this.
Hey.
Yeah, tell me. Yeah, believe me, I'm a caffeine addict too. But it's partly because of like the stress of like modern life, and it's partly because we have like no communities to rely on, partly because our families are so far away from us. Like, these are all like historical, like interlocking or interactive systems, right? That like play out on individual and the most intimate levels, from like the inside of our brains and our hearts, like to the tips of our fingers, right? Like from everything, like skin conditions, autoimmune problems, cancers, like
I have
everything.
psoriasis.
It's like these are like historical forces that play out on us, right? That like everything, like and like neoliberalism and capitalism is written across our bodies, right? Like, this is just a fact, right?
Oh, yeah.
So like partly coming to terms with all these things is like heavy work, and it's like all day long, and it's like all you can think about, and it's also extremely depressing. And so partly what liberalism does for us is it provides a kind of like I would say a salve, or a kind of like theoretical overlay, or a kind of moral and ethical overlay that helps us come to terms with this. Oh, we're doing this for the greater good, or we're doing this for a thing like progress.
Right.
Like, just think about the term progress, right? Like, progress where? Progression to what?
Exactly.
Like, along what line?
Can I add this as a social worker, right? I work with my day job is not this. I actually work with people that are getting out of long-term incarceration, it's fucked. All right.
Yeah.
The every single fucking thing that is like funded by some grant of like the state or the federal government is understaffed, it's under budgeted. It like I'm burnt the fuck out, right? You know, I've been burnt the fuck out. Most of the people I work with and most of the people I work with
My
in
sister is
another
a social
program,
worker. Yeah.
yeah, are burnt the fuck out. And it's like the communities themselves are burnt the fuck out. Like, let alone like the
And
people
this is
that are
by
coming
design.
in. Yeah.
This is by design. You're not supposed to be like a fulfilled human subject. You're supposed to be burnt out.
Right.
Like partly it's to deny us the spiritual excitement of demanding better things.
Right.
Right. Which is why in a moment like this, and like, yeah, we've been talking about all the negative stuff, but to see people, human beings who live under the most brutal conditions, to not just resist, but resist successfully is so inspirational. And to like go back to being negative again, this is why the culture industry works so hard to appropriate these narratives and these images and to spin them as commodity like capitalism, to turn them into the MCU franchise, to turn them into like, you know, the Star Wars,
Yeah.
right?
When
Like,
are we getting a Palestinian Marvel character?
Yeah,
I
could you
can't wait.
imagine? Like-
I will literally. I won't say it. It's terms of service if I say it, but it's just like I'll be sitting at the edge of my bed, you know, thinking some things pretty long and hard.
So you brought up, and this is going back a little bit, but this is something that I wanted to bring up with you because it seems like this might be like your field of, you know, educational expertise. But when it comes to that 18th century situation, what we spent like a day kind of studying and watching videos on that I actually wasn't super aware of, and I think this really fits into everything that we're saying, this underlying current of coercion under liberalism, because that's the thing is like everything about liberalism is supposed to be about your personal liberty, the freedom to choose, the freedom to elect, and everything like that. But underlying this system of British, industrialization, not only are there horrid conditions in the workplaces and in the factories, but underlying that, there's these things called like workhouses, right? Where effectively, like if you just decided not to engage in that and to just effectively be homeless or to be a pauper, I think they generally refer to it as, you would effectively be incarcerated in what would so
it's incarceration.
Can you talk about maybe like the workhouse system a little bit? Because this is something that I feel like isn't discussed quite enough.
Well, so I'm not an expert on the workhouse system. I mean, I can tell you that like it's Victorian iteration,
right?
Like they intensified it. But it's like something that is
they had them
like
until like the 1940s.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, look, the U.S. has a workhouse system. They're just more advanced. It's a carceral, like the carceral and like the basically enslavement or getting paid like $1 an hour firefighters, right? Like this is a line you can draw from the workhouse system, from like the quasi medieval English workhouse system to like the American prison system, and how like and there's this entire wing of the American labor force which is incarcerated, which is paid like pennies to the hour, right? Like penny, you know, that this is the basis of a kind of industrial production, right? And so like the workhouse system is still with us. It's just like the way it's just you know, they're just industrial prisons now, but essentially you know, one of the sort of advancements of the workhouse system happens in 1834 with like the Poor Law Amendment, which is this kind of attempt to deal with a kind of like the obvious crises that are like social crises that are popping up on the streets of England, which is like you have like the consequences of like the enclosure of the commons and the sort of privatization of English rural life, and that system is now boiling over. Like the consequences of all that is now boiling over into like urban chaos, right? And like today, right, when you see those videos of like right wingers like posting videos of, oh, this is what Philadelphia looks like, blah blah blah, right? Like they're doing that because like they're being racist and like this is the image of the city they have. But like that was also something that like the English middle classes and like the upper classes were doing and saying like, oh, children are dying on our streets, there's corpses,
we don't want to see it.
wild dog, exactly, right? Like wild dogs are eating the bodies of dead people on the streets. Like this is like the system they built and they benefit from, that then now the images of that are in their face, right? And so partly the Poor Law was a way of fixing that. The Poor Law Amendment of 1834, right, was a way of fixing that and sort of squaring the circle of like, well, have you ever tried putting them in prison and extracting free labor out of them, right? Like this was one system of that, like dreamed of it. Now, partly what I studied was something, an earlier version of this, which was, like the poor law system is one sort of darker and more sort of like ostensibly violent wing or like branch of a sort of component of liberal history, which is basically, and like modern history too, which is like institutionalization, right? We built in the 18th century, 18th and then into the 19th century, we started building like bricks and mortar institutions where we put our problems, our social problems, and like we imagine
the upper class doesn't want to see it. We don't want to see it.
Yeah, and it's like it's an efficient place to produce.
We don't want to fix it, but we don't want to see it.
Can I add one more thing though, that like my brain has been broken and Pat probably sees this coming, right? Just why he's like turning away from me right now, is that Sylvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, and I do love this book, and it like changed my brain in the way that like I examine this time period of history, because it's like you kind of just think that like, oh well, patriarchy or like, a difference in sexes, right, has just always been present. But apparently, like, no, like it actually took like, breaking the peasant class, right, into two different groups of like male and female. And then there's another book called Transhistorical, which talks about like gender plurality, like throughout Europe. So take that, Sylvia, you could have honestly been better about that. And how, like, without that, right, you wouldn't really have like the enclosure of the commons. You wouldn't have necessarily like this this ability to just kind of roll over like the peasantry as it did, right? If you didn't have this partitioning of like the underclass of the peasantry into, this binary like, idea of there's the peasant woman, which is below the peasant man, right? And we literally have reverberations of that even today with like the whole red pill, like, Andrew Tate type assholes and all the other guys that, are about like, how to get a woman, or like, putting a woman back in the kitchen or some other like, insane nonsense. Right. And it is a historical reverberation of that process of breaking the peasantry further and further down, removing any sense of like, natural gender plurality, removing any sense of like, the matriarch within every like village throughout Europe that was like, this sort of social glue that like, held a structure of society within these villages before the rise of like the Vatican.
Yeah, I mean, this is like partly like industrial capitalism needed a class of people who were dispossessed from the land, who had no connection to the land they lived on, and they needed them to be mobile, and they needed to bring them to the cities, right? They need to bring them to the burgeoning cities, right? And like this is just that history, right? Like this is the consequences of that history. And so like the English were the most refined and the most probably the earliest to do this, but this is like a global history of like taking older forms of life and modernizing them violently by ripping out the roots, ripping out people from their roots, from their historical roots, and putting them into this kind of precarious position where they rely upon this kind of wage laboring existence, that's completely, that like is based around like the extraction of wealth, right? So like ground rent or whatever, right? Like people can't live on the earth anymore live anymore for free.
No.
They just live. They have to rent it from someone, or they have to buy it from someone, right? Like this is not like, this is a modern creation, right? That the humanity is now like all lives by, right? Like I mean here in Toronto, it's one of the most expensive cities on the planet. I mean, I don't know how people make a life here. I just simply don't know.
Come to New Jersey and see the cheap prices of rent here in Jersey.
Like, and partly it has to do with the fact that like there's been this like the land is so productive in terms of how it creates wealth that like forget like the agricultural wealth that it created, that for generations that was then the basis of a certain class power or whatever, or like the extraction of trees or the extraction of minerals, right, that like creates whole classes of people, of rich people. But then that's not good enough. Then you build houses on it and then perpetuate that wealth scheme in perpetuity, basically, that like, you know, and then middle class people can get in on the action too, right? That like this becomes a more democratic form of extracting wealth from the land, because you don't have to be like a rich capitalist. You can just be like a schmo and like become a landlord, right? Like landlord, like think about like the term landlord used to mean, right? Like if you were a landlord in like 18th century England, that meant something, okay? You were born into that shit. Okay, you had
to inherit it.
Yeah, like you are someone to be feared. Today, the landlord is some dickless, some fucking loser, right? Like who doesn't work, who just sits at home and collects checks and whines and sends you texts.
It's wild that they haven't have a euphemism for landlord yet. It's crazy that there hasn't been a change in that structure. Like it still is like the same term used for like Chinese landlordism of the 1800s. Somehow the exact same thing that we call like the guy that doesn't even own your house, the guy who has a loan from a bank that you pay his mortgage, is the same is the same term,
right? Like, because we've changed like a number of terms in terms of wow, I just said the same word twice. A number of terms for representatives of like local government and stuff, from like freeholder to keyholder or some other nonsense, like, but not landlord.
Yeah, we still have landlord, lord, fucking lord. I mean, talk about it's
like literally a vestige of feudalism. It's still my lord.
I own this land by God.
Yeah, I am a lord. Respect me. So stupid. Fellas, I actually don't have a ton of time. I have to do something at 8. I don't know if we want to get into the book specifically.
I guess we should. I mean, we did advertise it that we would, but like, I don't know. I feel like we have been, maybe not to the same degree that like, you know, we advertised as.
I guess for me, the best aspect of this book is the fact that like, or at least this chapter, and then the worst aspect, we can come to it later, but like the obvious factor is that like pointing out that like one of the tenets of liberalism is like how much its words and its aspirations fail to live up to its like basic execution, so that like all the greatness of equality and like the sort of the dream of liberalism of like infinite equality, that like just completely goes by the wayside 2 minutes in. Then they're like, oh, except for black people, sorry. Oh yeah, except for colonized people.
Except for the indigenous people.
Like it's definitely except for indigenous people. That like it's the relation that ultimately what matters to liberalism is what matters to like other political systems, which is its relationship to like the material order of power. Right, that like that is the main, like that's like its kind of object of worship, right? That like money and the ability to sort of buy your way out of things, that like to this day, I mean, you see this in like how cities punish you for breaking the law, is that it issues you a fine. Or if you're a rich person, you don't care about that fine. If you're a poor person, that fine hurts you, right? And so like automatically,
it might shatter your entire life. Your entire life might come to a screeching halt if you get some kind of a fine that's
like that monetary. And so like even though money is the great equalizer in its very format of some people having more money than others because of their position in the class roster, like this is that like that itself breaks the sort of logic of liberalism of like all men are created equal, right? It's like unless they constitute the following constituencies, right? Like asterisk.
Oh, and also they better have been born into the right family.
Yeah. And like, so, I mean, but the thing is too, and like in the American version, the fetishization of, oh, we're free of these aristocratic vestiges. Like this is like, you know, this is like a sort of specifically American sort of like an offshoot of this, is that, oh, we're not like these old pedo Brits, we're our own
Right.
men or whatever. But like ultimately, like this same material basis, namely colonization, right, and the expropriation of like millions of people, tens of millions of people from their land, and the forcible expulsion and the abduction,
and
then
also
holding,
pedophilia.
and also pedophilia. like this is the basis of, like, there's a great line about like how the South, the basis of the economy was cotton and slavery, right, and like agricultural, like stealing land from indigenous people, stealing labor from Africa, right, that like and then combining those two together to create an immense, like unheard of amount of wealth. And then you have the industrial tycoons who came later, right, that when they destroyed all the trees and there was no more wealth on top of the land, and before that there was like the gold rush. I guess it was like a little bit after.
It's all just
like
ecocide. It's all just complete destruction.
Like it's
of
all ecocide,
farmland.
and
Yeah.
then it's the emergence of commodity crops and commodity agriculture, and so you create all kinds of wealth, and so it's never ending wealth creation, right? Like that's the center of liberal society. Like, and so like the overlay of like, oh, human beings have rights, oh, they're all special, they're all a snowflake, like this is all just horse shit that's fed to us. This is all just like cynical fucking horse shit that like liberals fight over to the death. Like they will a liberal will take you. Like I remember talking to someone once, a liberal, a well-meaning liberal, and I was like, oh yeah, like, and I just said like something that I say all the time, which is like, human rights don't exist, right? Like, this, right? That there's like no human has ever been given a right just on the basis of their humanity. Like this doesn't exist, right? Like a right is just law, and law is violence, and like backing those things up is like a violent machine of death and destruction and bombing from the sky. Like, so like, calling that a human right, you have the right, like the only human right we all have is the right to circulate as a commodity. Okay. I'm going to go out, people write that down. If you're going to take away from anything, if that's like something that I will, that's like something that I will go to the grave saying, that like this is not this fictional regime that's been erected over us since World War II. I guess since World War I, really.
We did read the Great Class War by Paul's on the stream. Took us a while.
I've never read that.
Oh, it's really good.
I think you would specifically really enjoy it.
Okay, I'll check it out. The Great Class War by Paul's. Okay, I'm writing it down.
It's a Pawels.
Yeah. Okay, right.
Yeah. Guess who recommended it?
Paul's. Okay, I'm gonna remember that. So like partly yes, and that's true. Actually, I've read. I'm now realizing that I was like, oh, I wonder if that's the book that those guys cited. Anyways, but like partly has to do with the fact that like these regime of like liberalism has taught us this kind of language of human value, right? That like human beings are valued for their own humanness, but that's a nice thing to say to each other, but in reality, human beings are valued for their contributions to the global economy, right? That like the more you contribute to that economy or the perception of contribution, then that's like the value of your life goes up. And this is just a straight up fact, right? Like this is something that is a good takeaway from this book. Now, mind you, there's like the whole machinery of like Italian boomer talking, so like all the horrible slurs. Actually, that is really on the translator. The translator should have cleaned that up. And they should have just made a note of it. There's no reason in 2011, but it's Verso.
I mean, it's Verso, so exactly.
What do you expect? They're like a stone's throw away from saying that stuff themselves.
By the way, these are all Lacerdo books.
Hey,
these are all
showing off.
Liberalism, war and revolution, nonviolence.
It's a shame he didn't live through the podcast era. I mean, he did.
I wish he lived. I wish we got more out of him, especially because of COVID too. Where like there was one point where I wanted to talk about like the altar of sacrifice, where literally we had people on TV saying you need to sacrifice grandma for the economy. Like imagine Lacerdo, right, during the height of COVID, where tensions with China are at an all-time high. We're literally sacrificing grandma on the altar of the economy. Like
Like the Chinese have lived up to liberal capitalism's promises way more. Chinese communists fulfilled the promises of 19th century British liberals way more than any fucking pedo island aristocrat ever has,
Right.
or American, or ever European. Okay, the dream of like a cheap life funded and protected by the state, where you just live your life, like this is way closer to existing in a place like China than anywhere in the like just monstrous vampiric West that we're all imprisoned in. I mean, come on. Like, talk about like I mean, I'll scream this until my dying days, but like the irony that these Oriental communists that like we imagine in our brains as all being this kind of monolithic 1.5 billion people,
right,
that they fulfilled the promise of capitalism, of like liberal capitalism, way better than anyone else ever fucking did. I mean, this is what the Marxist thesis was, that like eventually communism will give way, like liberal capitalism will give way to communism, because that's the end result. Because like the logic of it takes us there, where like the wealth of society is divvied up in a healthier manner, such that you lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in like 10 fucking seconds, which is what the Chinese did. I mean, like we're not allowed to talk about this stuff in our political atmosphere.
No,
but
let alone our academic one.
But decades from now, we will be, maybe, hopefully, if the planet still exists, like decades from now, like we will be able to say this stuff, that like, holy shit, like in a span of 3 decades, 2 decades even, you could say, like there was a massive leap forward in the quality of life of a chunk of the fucking planet. Okay,
yeah.
That like, and which is
Also,
something like a
that's
Star
even
Trek
more
proportions.
Yeah, because China is the only third world country to pull itself to first world status. It's literally unprecedented. Like even like it's not just like a
in
country.
like a few decades.
It's not just a country. It's not like America or Britain or France or something in the height of
a chunk of the
imperial
planet.
prominence.
Yeah.
China is looked at as, because it went from being like a destitute third world.
Yeah, no
nation.
running water in like a huge chunk of the country.
Exactly.
And if you read The Divide by Jason Hickel, literally every single accomplishment of every anti-poverty think group that like the UN or whatever international body creates, without Chinese development, right, they literally go backwards. Every benchmark that they hope to meet literally just goes backwards.
This is also true for like the green revolution that's taking place, like the solar revolution. Like without China, all of our benchmarks, like China is raising the planet's like ability to sustain itself just single-handedly, right? And like partly has to do, and this goes back to the deeper question that liberals are terrified of exploring, which is a strong centralized government that privileges, to use a treasured term of liberals, privileges social growth over the wealth of individuals, private individuals. This is what that accomplishes. Now, you can throw any kind of dystopian fucking shit at me. Maybe the chat is doing it. Let me check the chat.
No, probably.
Chat, are you saying any bullshit? I'm looking at the chat. Blah. Okay, looks like all good. Sina, exclamation mark. I don't know what that means. The century of humiliation. Yes. Like these people were occupied in 1949. They were occupied by several different European powers.
Oh, earlier than that, I think by Japan.
Until
yeah,
1949.
right. Yeah, you're right.
Like this were occupied and humiliated by a bunch of like pasty skinned Europeans that weren't even there in that great of a number. Right? Like think of the deep
they were just
spiritual,
so weak at the time. Yeah,
like they were just so weak, and in less than a century, they have excelled to the point where they are literally the most powerful country in the world. And by powerful, I don't mean like military power or whatever. I just mean as like a social force on the planet, a social, productive, industrial force. Nothing even comes close. the US and its fake ass GDP, right? Which is like lawyers getting paid $10,000 an hour, right? Like that's the economy of and fucking NFTs and real estate swaps, right? Like that's the US GDP, right? Like China actually makes shit and they sell it to the rest of the planet. And they do so in a way that enables other parts of the planet to move forward. They don't have the kind of parasitic relationship that US industrialization has, where the world gave it all of its great fucking shit and everybody gets back fucking meaningless dollars, which they used to get paper at least. Now they don't even get fucking paper, right? You used to get paper back for all the, now you get shit on a screen someplace in fucking Virginia, right? And like this is the chaotic, and like this world system is what we're seeing falling. I guess the question is, and I asked this a lot on my podcast, is like, will the US take down the rest of the world with it? Like, will they take us to hell?
It'll try.
Yeah, like I think they will try. Whether they will succeed.
Like, look. What we see right now happening, like across the Sahel and Africa, with China that you brought up, throughout the Levant, right? The Middle East at large, right? We've seen like tremors of, the House of Saud, right? Willing to kind of just turn the knob more towards the east rather than the west, right? We've seen Central and South America, right, numerous times throughout its history try and declare its independence from the U.S.'s backyard. We've seen just every region of the world except for like that little peninsula of Asia. Maybe one day they'll learn what's good for them, but like that the U.S., right, will fuck you every time. If it's between you and the U.S., it'll be the
Europeans do. That's the story of Europe, bro. It's exploitation.
But that's the thing, is they're being exploited by the U.S. They would have they would have better trade terms with the rest of the world at this point, if not for the U.S.
The one good thing that the U.S. does is fuck over Europe. That's the funniest thing. That's the only contribution to historical justice, is the fact that the U.S. basically colonized Europe.
Right.
And like it did to Europe what Europe did to the rest of the world, which it turned it to a fucking vassal and sacrificed it. Now I'm being very dark in saying that because
no, it's 100% accurate though.
It's a lot of poor people are dying for it. Like poor Ukrainians are dying. Like all kinds of people starve in their homes.
Exactly. Like, there's English teachers right now that can't afford to heat their homes, put the lights on, right? Yeah, I mean, they can barely afford fucking food.
That the U.S. wants. That's the crazy things that Europe is an occupied continent. They have like 30,000 troops, like 30,000 U.S. troops, like colonized. Maybe fewer now, but essentially it's like, that's what NATO is. NATO is just a weapon of the US to bully governments, and then they have their gladio to make sure that like any sort of stragglers, so like this world system that we're in now, this so-called like rules-based world order, like this is like, it's just this insane like mafioso, like fucking Tony Soprano runs the planet, and it's just like, and that's something that we're seeing more and more openly as like the US grows more like weaker and weaker, is that it's like, the mask off thing is definitely happening.
I wouldn't even say it was Tony though. I would say it was more like what it was under Junior. I would say it's just, just not there incoherent.
A resident New Jersey, and you know what I mean, to weigh
true.
in on the analogy of Tony, of the Sopranos and geopolitical dynamics. So expect a further explanation on that.
It's true. It's
definitely more of a Junior style leadership. All right. Especially since we got Biden right now.
Great. Yeah.
I would almost say Ralphie. This is almost a Ralphie style situation.
Joey Pence. I don't know. Yeah, it's this is like the liberalism is this problem for all of us, and neoliberalism is its guise today, and like the creation, the sort of emergence of neoliberalism is partly a result of the fact that like that liberalism wasn't working, that like the economic system, the sort of golden era of the US economy is long over by 65, 70 or something, and it has to create all of these new forms of wealth creation. And partly what it does is, like destroy, like take the cities away from racialized minorities who had sort of like filled in the places that they weren't allowed to live in, right, during segregation because whites fled to the suburbs. And so you create these like crime pandemics, and you just put a huge ton of the population into jails. That makes these towns a ghost town, that makes them cheap for development. Your corporate class comes in, they move in, they buy up huge chunks of the cities, they build them up in these real estate schemes. The children of the people who move to the suburbs come streaming back with their fake email jobs or like whatever. And it's like this system that's one of the facets of like US social life, is like the vast expulsion of racialized minorities, or the ghettoization of racialized minorities, and then their vast incarceration, right? To the tune of like, like that. Talk about authoritarianism. The US is the world's leading authoritarian state. If you define authoritarianism as like pension to sort of throw a chunk of your population into jail if you don't like them.
And now, yeah, right? I mean, in the international respect, I say that the United States is the greatest force against democracy of the past 200 years in the world.
Yeah.
Just by the way, did you hear about Texas?
Just like France. Just like the herald, like the sort of the banner holders of liberalism were also Kelsapries, the most reactionary forces that sought to stymie social development of large parts of the world. Why? Because it threatened their material base of power, right? Like, so partly I would say fighting liberals is this problem, right? Is that like, it's not like getting past their inability to sort of recognize basic material truths about our order is like a real, I mean, this is the uphill battle, right? Because they get mad at you, and they get, and they try to change the subject, and they're like, oh my God. And they're like, oh, look at China, look at this. How do you want to be like that? Oh, or like if they're Zionists, they'll say, oh, look at the Middle East, whatever. Like this is just a game, right? Like ultimately it's an inability to look at oneself and to be honest about the nature of our own society, the nature of our sociality. Oh shit, it's 7:50. I should probably run, guys. But This was a lot of fun.
Can we expect you on again?
Yeah, of course. I'll come back.
All right. Maybe we'll have you on Discord next time, and everything will go
Yeah. We'll do Discord.
Less hectic.
It'll be less hectic. Thank you, chat. It was nice not looking at what you say.
Never look at what chat says.
Never look at the chat. That's
Never.
Maybe I'll start a Twitch. I'll rival you guys.
There you go. Yeah, I'm coming for your spot, pretty much.
I'm coming for your audience.
That's what this is all about.
Yeah, so check out the podcast if you haven't listened. People who are listening to the chat, it's called The East is a Podcast. It's more of my ravings. And take care, guys.
Thanks again, Sina.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
No problem. Take care.
Have a good one.
So don't run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. And treat them like that and fight them, and you'll get your freedom. My repertoire is USSR. PLO style, PLO style got thrown out the car. Rise for subversive plots. They'll call you an extremist or subversive or red radical. Rise for subversive plots. Red radical. And fight them. Capitalism and democracy. Capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. We group us up like ants in a colony. Organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the communities. And all my comrades is ready, we just spreading the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we just spreading the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we just spreading